Women's suffrage in Wales has historically been marginalised due to the prominence of societies and political groups in England which led the reform for women throughout the United Kingdom. Due to differing social structures and a heavily industrialised working-class society, the growth of a national movement in Wales grew but then stuttered in the late 19th century in comparison with that of England. Nevertheless, distinct Welsh groups and individuals rose to prominence and were vocal in the rise of suffrage in Wales and the rest of Great Britain. In the early 20th century, Welsh hopes of advancing the cause of female suffrage centred around the Liberal Party and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, one of the most important Welsh politicians of the day. After Liberals' success in the 1906 election failed to materialise into political change, suffragettes and in particular members of the more militant Women's Social and Political Union, took a hardline stance towards the members of Parliament, engaging in direct action against them. Militant action was not a hallmark of the movements in Wales, and Welsh members, who more often identified themselves as suffragists, sought parliamentary and public support through political and peaceful means. In 1918, across the United Kingdom, women over the age of 30 gained the right to vote, followed by the Representation of the People Act 1928, which saw women gain the same rights to vote as men. The history of women's suffrage in Wales. Women were not explicitly banned from voting in Great Britain until the 1832 Reform Act and the 1835 Municipal Corporations Act. In England, the suffrage movement existed before and after the 1832 Act, but did not form a national organisation until the creation of the National Society for Women's Suffrage in 1872. Although there were notable exceptions such as the working-class areas of Lancashire, the women's suffrage movement in England was predominantly a middle-class movement. In Wales there were only two narrow bands of wealthy society in the anglicised north and south coastal areas. Much of the female population of an emerging 19th-century Wales was based in the low-waged, densely populated, industrialised valleys of the south. At first, women found work in metalworking and coal extraction, but then faced mass unemployment after the 1842 Mines and Collieries Act had prohibited them from working underground. The coal mining industry, with its absence of pithead baths, led to unpaid women's employment as the need to keep both the homes and the families menfolk clean became a never-ending task. This led to the image of the stoic Welsh mam, a matriarch of the home, but little could be further from the truth in a society controlled by men. The increase of wealth created by the mining and metalworking industry saw the creation of new upper-class families who often built the wealthy homes in the center of the community from which they prospered, whereas the pit and foundry owners were initially men, many of whom had political ambitions. The wives sought more charitable activities often connected to improving the lives of the women and children of their husbands' workers. In Dowlais, the heart of the ironworking industry of Wales, Rose Mary Crawshay, the well-to-do English-born wife of Robert Thomson Crawshay, passed her time in such charitable work. She set up soup kitchens, gave to the poor and established no less than 7 libraries in the area. But apart from this work, for which she would be expected to do, she was also a staunch feminist, living under the rule of a notoriously tyrannical husband, for whom she bore 5 children. She showed a strong will and was known in feminist circles in London from the 1850s. In 1866 she and 25 other signatories, all based in Wales, signed the country's first women's suffrage petition. In June 1870, Rose Crawshay Crauchete held a public meeting at her home, probably the first in Wales to discuss women's suffrage, but she was later taken to task by the local newspaper for disturbing the peace and leading Wales's women astray. The first suffrage tour of Welsh towns was conducted the following year by Jessie Cragen, who travelled the south of the country visiting Pontypool, Pembroke Dock, Neyland, Saundersfoot and Newport. On 4 March 1872, Mrs. Crauchete held a second meeting in Merthyr Tydfil, which resulted in a new petition being delivered, the effect of which saw the signing of petitions from Glamorgan, Monmouthshire, Denbighshire and Cardiganshire. Later that year, the Bristol and Amp, West of England Society for Women's Suffrage sent two of the members, Caroline Biggs and Lilias Ashworth, on a sponsored speaking tour of South Wales which took in Pontypool, Newport, Cardiff and Haverfordwest. Despite the actions of several prominent Welsh women, such as Lady Amberley and Miss Gertrude Jenner of Wenvo, no real suffrage movements took hold in the 1870s, and the country was reliant on speaking tours from members of English societies, predominantly from Bristol, London and Manchester. On the 25th of February 1881, Gertrude Jenner addressed a meeting held in Cardiff Town Hall to consider means of promoting interest in Cardiff towards female voting rights. This was a preliminary to a larger meeting that was held on the 9th of March, which was attended by local dignitaries. Miss Jenner, Helen Blackburn, and was chaired by the Mayor of Cardiff. Despite there being a great deal of suffrage activity in the lead-up to the Third Reform Act of 1884, there was little campaigning in Wales during the early 1880s. One act of significant importance that did occur during this period was the decision in late 1884 by the delegates of the Aberdare, Merthyr and Dowlais District Mine Association to support a series of talks by Jeanette Wilkinson on the right of women's votes. This is the first recorded instance of interest by Welsh working men supporting female suffrage. Suffragist societies in Wales, 1884 to 1906. The publication of the Reform Acts of 1867 and 1884, both of which extended suffrage for men in the United Kingdom, led to large-scale political organisation. These, combined with the outcome of the Corrupt Practices Act of 1883, which prevented the payment of canvasses, led to both Conservative and Liberal parties approaching female supporters to aid them in political campaigning. The Conservatives were first to offer a political role for women in Wales with the opening of branches of the Primrose League, but campaigning for women's rights was not its priority and merely aimed to interest women in politics. In response, the Liberal Party launched women's liberal associations, which allowed women more freedom to allocate a role and voice for themselves and were not a mere subsidiary of the National Party. The organisation of women in the Liberal Party in Wales began around 1890, supported by prominent members Gwyneth Vaughan, Nora Phillips and Sybil Thomas. In 1891, an Aberdare branch of the Women's Liberal Foundation was founded, and it quickly began advocating votes for women and began leafleting in both English and Welsh. By 1893 there were said to be 7,000 members of the Welsh Union of Women's Liberal Associations, which had raised to 9,000 by 1895. At a meeting of the North Wales Liberal Foundation in 1895, it was decided that Women's Liberal Federation would merge with Cymru FYDD, a political pressure group for Home Rule, to form a new Welsh Liberal Federation, and equal rights for women were written into the objects of the organisation. Despite some early successes, Liberal organisation floundered as they headed into the new century, and apart from the Cardiff branch, which achieved some successes, many of the branches had closed by 1907. Pressure groups. 1897 saw the foundation of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies under the leadership of Millicent Fawcett. This was a non-political organization which was formed out of the 17 strongest societies throughout England. It took until 1907 before the first branch of the NUWSS was formed in Wales. This occurred during a meeting at the Llandudno Cocoa House which saw Mrs. Walton Evans become the president of the local cell. Other branches soon began forming across Wales, with the creation of the Cardiff and District branch in 1908 followed by Rhyl, Conwy and Bangor in 1909. The more militant arm of the suffrage movement, the Women's Social and Political Union, was not strong in Wales. In 1913 it had 5 branches in Wales compared to 26 for the NUWSS. That said, the WSPU had been active in promoting itself in Wales long before this, with Emmeline Pankhurst and Mary Gawthorpe holding meetings throughout Wales in 1906. In 1908 both the WSPU and the NUWSS were active in Pembrokeshire to campaign at a by-election. The slogan of "Keep the Liberals Out" would not have resonated with the Welsh voters. As in the election of 1906, not a single Tory had won a seat in Wales. Nonetheless, the main political target was Liberal Prime Minister H. Asquith, who was vehemently opposed to the enfranchisement of women. David Lloyd George and the suffrage movement. 1907 to 1912 attitudes towards the suffragette movement as a whole were badly affected by militant actions led mostly by members of the WSPU. In July 1908 the Women's National Anti-Suffrage League was inaugurated, with Welsh MP Ivor Guest serving as treasurer. The initial involvement of Ermine Taylor led to a branch of the WNESL being formed in Denbighshire the following year. Undeterred, the pro-suffrage groups continued to take direct action. In Bristol in 1908, Winston Churchill had been threatened by WSPU members, and the widespread anger after the event led to a Cardiff meeting led by Charlotte Despard being abandoned. In Merthyr the speakers were drowned out and herrings and tomatoes thrown at them. Despite being a favoured son of Wales, is an outwardly pro-women's suffrage Liberal MP, and from 1908 the Chancellor of the Exchequer. David Lloyd George was often a target of suffragette activity, although Lloyd George always stated his support to the suffrage movement in public speeches. The failure of the Liberal government to make any progress on implementing change led Christabel Pankhurst to believe him to be a secret anti-suffragist. Pankhurst was quoted in the Times in November 1911 declaring, "Lloyd Georgitis seemed to be a disease which afflicted men today with very few exceptions, but women saw through him. They had always known him as an anti-suffragist, and they must fight him here and now." Pankhurst's assumptions had a basis of truth, as a month before Lloyd George had written to the Liberal Party chief whip bemoaning the fact that the forthcoming Conciliation Bill would hand hundreds of thousands of votes to the Tory party. The year 1912 saw a marked increase in militant action in Wales. Anger at the defeat of the conciliation bills saw the WPSU disrupt a speech by Lloyd George at the Pavilion in Carnarvon. The protesters, male and female, were treated harshly, with clothes torn and hair ripped out, and were beaten by sticks and umbrellas. Later that year Lloyd George was again heckled by suffragettes whilst delivering a speech at the National Eisteddfod. Just 2 weeks later, one of the most notorious events in the history of suffrage in Wales took place, when Lloyd George returned to his hometown of Llanystumdwy to open the village hall. No sooner had he started speaking than he was interrupted by the cries of "Votes for Women." The hecklers were violently assaulted by the crowd. One was stripped to the waist before being rescued, and another was almost thrown off a bridge to be dashed on the rocks of the River Dweevor below. As trouble was anticipated, the national press was present, and the Daily Mirror and Illustrated London News devoted a full page of photographs to the incident. The local press not only attacked the suffragettes but poured scorn on the crowd for tarnishing the image of a peaceful, nonconformist, chapel-going Wales. The event is seen as the most dramatic event in the history of women's suffrage in Wales. As the 1910s unfolded, attitudes hardened on both sides of the emancipation issue. In 1912, the anti-suffrage WNASL was amalgamated into the newly formed National League for Opposing Women's Suffrage, and the Chancellor branch of the NLOWS was established in Bangor. Of the 286 branches of the organisation, 19 were eventually formed in Wales. Two of the most prolific supporters of the NLOWS in Wales were both Members of Parliament, Ivor Guest and J.D. Rees. In the years leading up to the outbreak of the First World War, the NUWSS spent its time in North Wales organising educational and propaganda campaigns. In South Wales, friction was caused by a shift in political views pushed onto the country from the central office. 1912 saw the NUWSS switch its policy as a non-party organisation to set up the Election Fighting Fund to support the newly burgeoning Labour Party. Wales had traditionally been a liberal heartland, and the South Wales Federation of Women's Suffrage Societies was opposed to this new policy. There was a sense that there was a disjoint between the central English feminist agenda pushed by the militant headquarters and the needs of Welsh social, cultural and political views. The strains existed between the two organisations until the F was abandoned in 1914. In 1913, a suffrage pilgrimage was organised, to end with a rally in Hyde Park, London on the 26th of July. It was an attempt to remind the public of the larger constitutional and non-militant wing of the movement, and routes were planned from 17 British towns and cities, including Wales. 28 members from Welsh NUWSS branches left from Bangor on the 2nd of July, travelling through Wales, where they were met with both support and hostility. A further branch left Cardiff on the 7th of July. 1913 also saw a continuation of more hardline methods, with the WPSU firebombing a house which was being built for Lloyd George. Between April and September 1913, hoax bombs were set at both Cardiff and Abergavenny, and at Llantarnam, telegraph wires were cut. This period also saw the actions of one of Wales's most notable suffragettes, Margaret Haig Mackworth, daughter of MPD A. Thomas and his activist wife Sybil Thomas. Mackworth had been recruited into the WPSU in 1908 and had been a vocal and active member from that date, later founding the Newport branch of the organisation. In 1913 she was convicted of setting fire to a post box and, after refusing to pay the fine, was sent to prison at Usk. While imprisoned, Mackworth went on hunger strike, but was released under the Cat and Mouse Act. By 1914, the non-militant elements of the suffrage movement had built up a steady presence and, although damaged by the bad press violent action brought, they also gained from the publicity. A summer school had been set up by the NUWSS in the Conwy Valley the previous year, and now the members were benefiting from the training in public speaking that was given. In South Wales, signs of working-class involvement in the suffrage cause took shape through the Women's Cooperative Guild. with a branch opening in Tunpentre in the Rhondda in 1914 run by Elizabeth Andros. With the outbreak of the First World War, all WSPU activity came to a halt and the NUWSS turned much of the focus to relief work. The WPSU, reformed as the Women's Party from 1917, sent members across Wales, no longer to rally for suffrage but to encourage male volunteers to join the British Army. In 1915, Flora Drummond attended a rally in Merthyr to demand that men leave occupations that women could undertake, and to stop hiding behind the petticoats. Women in Wales took up employment en masse, especially in newly opened munitions factories, and in 1918 the Newport Shell factory had a female workforce of 83%, while the Queen's Ferry factory was 70%. The militant suffragettes, who were at one point public enemies, were now seen as fierce nationalists and patriots. Old foes became allies and vice versa. Lloyd George was now referred to as the Great Welshman, while Labour's Keir Hardie, the WSPU's staunchest defender before the war, was lambasted for his pacifist stance. There were still those in the suffragette movement who wished to keep pushing the agenda of emancipation. Some members of the WSPU broke away to form the Suffragettes of the WSPU. Amongst the members were Conway-born Helena Jones, who continued to campaign for women's votes and was a columnist in the Suffragists' news sheet. The Representation of the People Act was passed in 1918, which gave women over the age of 30, who met a property qualification, the right to vote. Several factors led to the passing of the Act, including the efforts of working women, the dilution of anti-suffrage rhetoric and political change in London, where Asquith had been replaced as Prime Minister by Lloyd George. The government believed that 6 million voters would be added by the 1918 Act. In Wales, the electorate rose from 430,000 to 1,172,000. During the First World War, relief work helped keep the women's societies in Wales active, though membership numbers began to fall. After the People's Act of 1918, many of the regional branches began to wither. The Llangollen WSS resolved to disband in December 1918, handing the marching banner to the National Council, believing the work was done, while others, such as the Newport branch, revised their aims to form a women's citizen association taking an active interest in welfare and social issues. Other branches continued the political vision of equal suffrage, notably Bangor, while the Cardiff WSS busied itself by attempting to secure the election of women to local government posts. The fact that the terms of enfranchisement were not equal to men ensured that the surviving suffragist societies still had a focus, and the first point of order was the bill to admit women as MPs. This was passed in October 1918 and 17 women stood at the 1918 general election. There was one female candidacy in Wales, Millicent Mackenzie, a former professor of education from the University College of South Wales and Monmouthshire, who unsuccessfully contested the newly formed University of Wales seat. It took until 1929 for Wales to return its first female MP, Megan Lloyd George, the youngest daughter of the former Prime Minister. In 1921, Margaret Mackworth, now the second Viscountess Rhondda, launched the 6-Point Group, an action group that focused heavily on the equality between men and women and the rights of the child. Mackworth continued to strive towards equality for women and emerged as one of the leading feminist campaigners in Britain during the interwar period. She established a number of women's organizations, pressure groups, and launched the influential feminist journal Time and Tide. She also made an unsuccessful bid to gain entry into the House of Lords, fighting against a 1922 ruling that barred the admission of women. Equal franchise was eventually won with the passing of the Representation of the People Act 1928. This was not achieved through a matter of course, but through a constant campaign of organized pressure. The NUWSS reorganized into the National Union of Societies for Equal Citizenship, taking on a broader range of issues to secure more widespread support. The Women's Freedom League, which was formed in 1907 out of schism caused by Emmeline Pankhurst's desire for a more authoritarian style of leadership within the WSPU, was a vocal advocate of equal rights throughout the 1920s. In 1919 there were 4 WFL branches in Wales, and, although the Aberdyfi and Cardiff branches had disbanded by 1921, both Montgomery boroughs and Swansea remained staunchly active throughout the decade. Suffragists versus militancy. The women's suffrage movement in Wales has historically been held in poor regard, with little research undertaken before the end of the 20th century. Initial impressions of women's voting rights in the country can appear to suggest apathy or even hostility towards suffrage, but historians such as Kay Cook and Neil Evans, writing in 1991, and built upon by Dr. Kirsty Bowater, argue specific cultural environments led to a more cautious and considered political ideology. The type of militancy advocated by Emmeline Pankhurst's Women's Social and Political Union appears to have been rejected by the majority of Welsh suffrage campaigners, especially in the north of Wales. But Cook claims that the origin of this lies in the 1847 governmental reports of the Commissioners of Inquiry into the State of Education in Wales, commonly known as the treachery of the Blue Books. In 1846, after a parliamentary speech by Radical MP William Williams, concerns were raised regarding the level of education in Wales. This resulted in an inquiry carried out by 3 English commissioners appointed by the Privy Council, none of whom had any knowledge of the Welsh language, non-conformity or elementary education. The findings of the report were immensely detailed and were damning towards not only the state of education in Wales but drew a very critical picture of the Welsh as a people, labelling them as immoral and backwards. Within its pages, Welsh women were labelled as licentious and cut off from civilizing influences by the impenetrable Welsh language. The report drew questions over the chastity of the poor and was just as damning to the wealthier women of the country, claiming that English farmers' daughters were respectable, while the Welsh counterparts Wales were in the constant habit of being courted in bed. The result of the report led to a concerted effort to ensure that Welsh women would in future be above rebuke, and several Welsh periodicals were launched in the decades following, aimed at improving housekeeping and to improve the morality of the Welsh readership. One of the first periodicals to launch after the publication, and in direct response to, the Blue Books was Why Jim Race. Its editor Evan Jones, known by his bardic name of Iwan Gwynedd, was seen as a champion of Welsh women following his detailed defence of their morality following the controversy surrounding the report. Why Jim Race, launched in January 1850, set out to create the perfect Welshwoman, a virtue of morality, sobriety and thrift, a beacon that would see the Welsh nation above all future criticism. As early as the autumn of 1851, with the health of its editor failing, Why Jim Race was merged with the monthly penny periodical Why Tywysydd, and became Why Tywysydd ar Jim Race in early 1852. Despite its title, the majority of the contributors were men, and the publication continued to emphasize the importance of high moral standards rather than give practical advice. Although the publication continued into the 1880s, it eventually made way for Wythrythonis under the editorship of Sarah Jane Rees. Although these periodicals had their roots in the temperance movement, many of the articles within the pages were frivolous. By the 1880s they began broaching the topic of female emancipation. Jane Aaron in 1994 described how the desire for Welsh womanhood to be seen as respectable in the eyes of its colonial neighbour endured even when their English counterparts had decided to take up an aggressive or unwomanly mantle to achieve the goals of female emancipation. Boata builds on this hypothesis, stating that the idealized Welsh woman, inspired by England's middle-class angel of the house, would represent Welsh respectability long after English women had abandoned the halos in favour of bicycles.